Welcome back to Psychology of Learning with Dr. Goodin. We'll be talking about Chapter 12, which is titled Forgetting. It is common for psychologists to think of memory as being stored in the brain indefinitely, like an attic full of experiences. However, often we are unable to retrieve memories, or our memories are altered from a factual state. When we learn something, we have acquired information, whether it be conceptual or behavioral. We have hypothetically the ability to lose that information. Forgetting is deterioration in performance of learned behavior following a retention interval. A retention interval means the period during which learning or practice of the behavior, in this case, gaining information, does not occur. Therefore, the phrase use it or lose it seems appropriate. It is important to note that learning experiences produce physical changes in the nervous system, and presumably something happens to the structures of the brain when forgetting occurs. When we forget, it is our behavior that changes. Not all deterioration in learning behavior following a retention interval is due to forgetting. A stroke or aging process may be at play. And there seem to be degrees of forgetting. In free recall, the individual is given the opportunity to perform a previously learned behavior. However, being unable to recall something does not define forgetting. A person may remember the word later, or may remember that it has 3 syllables, etc. They may remember characteristics of it. Prompted or cued recall involves presenting hints or prompts to increase the likelihood that the behavior will be produced, or remembered in this case. The prompts are stimuli that were not present during training. The relearning method measures forgetting in terms of the amount of training required to reach the previous level of performance. Since there is usually a savings compared to the original training program, this is also called the savings method. In other words, how much of the original information was saved. Another way of measuring forgetting is called recognition. The participant must identify the material previously learned. You may recall a multiple choice test. You recognize the answer, you choose it. Delayed matching to sample is often used with pigeons. Similarly, the extinction method can be used wherein extinction that proceeds rapidly is evidence of forgetting. Gradient degradation refers to forgetting as measured by a flattening of the generalization gradient. To the extent that the training establishes stimulus control, and a decline in the steepness of the generalization gradient indicates forgetting. So where does forgetting come from? What are the sources? Most people think that the passage of time without practice results in forgetting. The question is whether the passage of time actually causes the forgetting. Since time is not an object or thing, it cannot be a cause. Degree of learning. The better the degree of learning, the better something is learned, and the more slowly it is forgotten. Learning continues even after we seem to have achieved mastery. This is called overlearning. Overlearning involves relearning something after a retention interval. After you've already learned it, you keep practicing it and keep going over it and learning it. Learning something, letting it set, then relearning it again is a good way for you to practice for tests or quizzes. Prior learning is also important. Forgetting occurs rapidly when we learn unrelated words, random digits, and nonsense syllables. More meaningful material is easier to hold on to. Material that has meaning or has been priorly learned or seen or discussed. Prior learning can be seen in terms of expertise. A study of master chess players and novice chess players showed that master chess players could look at a chessboard and reproduce the arrangement of pieces much more accurately than their novice counterparts. Is it a matter of previous learning, or do chess masters simply forget less? Since the recall abilities were specific only to chess, they were deemed not to have exceptional memories. Sometimes previous learning can interfere with recall. This is called proactive interference. How many of you have ever moved or gotten a new phone number? Do you remember the difficulty you had learning the new address or phone number? Your task was made more difficult due to the prior information that conflicted with the new information. Proactive interference is often studied by means of paired associate learning, wherein a person learns word pairs and given the first word is asked to produce the second word. When studying recall of a story, one that was quite disjointed and confusing, a researcher found that over time people use their prior learning of how a story should be constructed to fix the confusing story into a simplified, more cohesive story in their recollections. Research shows that we are more likely to remember information that we agree with. Retroactive interference refers to the forgetting of previously learned information as a result of new information. Many of you can remember your very first address. That's the primacy effect. You may not be able to recall a less significant previous address or phone number because that storage space for information has been filled with your current information. Imagine a closet where new information covers up your old information. When reminded, you might say that you remember it. However, recall can be very difficult. Changes in context refer to stimuli present during learning that are not directly relevant to what is learned. And changes in the context in which learning occurs affect forgetting. Since the cues of the original context are not present, performance suffers. This is called cue-dependent forgetting, since it is due to the absence of stimuli that were present during learning. Even chewing gum while studying and chewing gum again while taking a test can help recall. There is a case to be made for the view that there is no such thing as forgetting, that our behavior is simply modified by changes in our environment. Based on this perspective, forgetting is actually an example of learning. Of course, forgetting and the research of forgetting has applications in the real world. Eyewitness testimony is of questionable value. Many things a witness may say are vulnerable to suggestion. A witness may ask if they saw a hat. Contrast that with a witness that is asked if they saw the hat. Learning to remember is an issue where overlearning becomes important. To forget less, learn more. Practice even after you are satisfied with your performance. The more thoroughly you learn something, the more slowly you will forget it. Practice with feedback. I will note here that much of this information is aligned with Dr. Anders Ericsson's research on expertise that says we must practice deliberately, with feedback, without distraction, in order to gain expertise. Ericsson is well known for the 10,000 hour rule of expertise. Ericsson tells us that practice does not make perfect unless that practice is focused in the right direction. One way to focus practice is through feedback, positive or negative. You may be able to provide feedback to yourself by self-quizzing, or you may be able to receive feedback from a teacher or classmate. Many students cram before an exam rather than distributing their practice of learning and knowledge performance over separate periods of time. Cramming is known as massed practice. The alternative is distributed or spaced practice. Spending 1 hour a day studying for 12 hours straight will produce greater knowledge acquisition than studying for 12 hours on the one day before a test. Consistent practice and learning produces the best results. You may have noticed that I ask you to reflect on everything you read on a consistent basis. I hope it helps you succeed in my class. One of the best ways to learn is to test yourself as you are learning. Read a page or a few pages, then test whether you acquire the knowledge from those pages. Summarize what those pages said. This will help you understand what you are learning and not learning. It is common for us to overestimate how much we've learned or to not truly evaluate whether we have learned. Of course, using mnemonics can help. A mnemonic is any device for aiding recall. Typically, these devices involve learning cues that will later prompt the desired behavior. One common mnemonic is rhyme. How do you remember the planets? How do you remember the spelling of the word peace? I before E except after C, right? That one includes rhyming. What about colors of the rainbow? Of course, as previously stated, context matters. You would do better on a test if you studied in the classroom you take the test in. We normally do the opposite, studying on our bed while eating crackers. As you study and practice your knowledge, testing your performance, do so in a context as similar as possible to the context that you will be tested under. Another strategy would be to study in a variety of situations, because what you learn is likely to be needed in a wide variety of situations. Take a problem-solving approach. Perhaps you forget a name. To solve this forgetting problem, you may implement strategies. Anything you can remember about the person's name or the person may be a valuable cue. Eventually, you may remember the first letter of the person's name. You may begin to sound out possible names, and eventually you may solve the problem. The point is that when the cues that are present are not sufficient to invoke the needed behavior, you can often provide new cues that will prompt the behavior. Take a problem-solving approach and figure out what those cues are. I'll see you in Chapter 13.